A few months ago, this product was announced out of nowhere. It's called the TinyPod, and it's a gadget that transforms your Apple Watch into this iPod looking thing, but it also has a scroll wheel. And the marketing around this thing is very interesting. It kind of hits on the whole nostalgia and like simplicity of a device like this. But because the core of this product is an Apple Watch, it has a lot of modern kind of smartphone functionality. You can stream and download music on this thing. You can check your messages. You can use it for maps, your email. Basically every app that exists on an Apple Watch, you have access to. But most importantly, you have access to a phone. Because if your Apple Watch has an LTE signal, you have a phone. And this tiny machine, this TinyPod, can suddenly be used as a tiny phone and in theory could replace an iPhone. Now, the nostalgia factor on this thing was very high. When I saw all this marketing, I was like, that is so cool. If this thing's like $100 or less, I want to try it. It turns out it's $79. Now, I was sent an early production sample last week, and it comes in a very simple packaging. It's kind of like, it's got some Apple vibes going on, but when you pop it open, the first thing I noticed was that there's like a very thin layer of grease on this whole thing. It didn't make sense at first, but you'll understand why in a second. But the other thing I noticed right out of the box was that this thing does not look nearly as nice in real life as it did in the renders. Like when I looked on the website and I was looking around, like everything looks so perfect on that site, and also the kind of plastic imperfections are not visible in the renders. But here, it almost feels like a child's toy, almost like a burner toy for kids. Like if Fisher-Price made a burner phone for kids, like this is what it would look like. But I got it in and I'm like, hey, I gotta check this thing out. Now this particular unit houses, the Apple Watch I'm putting here is an Apple Watch SE, but they make different sizes depending on the Apple Watch that you wanna throw in. But the first thing I checked out was the scroll wheel. And it works, but it's not great. It's not this smooth and effortless scroll wheel like you might expect or might hope. It's very inconsistent. Now, on this particular unit, I've even stuffed a piece of paper at the top of my Apple Watch just to be able to make sure that it's got a very snug fit, because this whole contraption needs to have very tight fitting parts to be able to make it go. So it fits perfectly. It's just that the mechanism is not perfect. Now, let me show you how this whole thing works, because it is interesting. The way they've done it, if you think about it, an Apple Watch is typically controlled by the crown. So how do you transfer the rotational energy of your scroll movements to turning the Apple Watch? So they have this neat mechanism that's entirely mechanical. There's no like wireless stuff. There's no electronics on the inside. It's just a mechanical system, and kind of cool. So it normally has screws. I removed those previously, but this is the scroll wheel. And as you spin it around, it has a series of pulleys that in turn activates the crown of the Apple Watch, which would sit inside like so. And as you rotate your scroll wheel and it turns the pulleys, it turns the crown. It's a neat mechanism, but if you're wondering why all that lube was sitting all over, this is a mechanical thing that needs to be well lubricated in order for it to move properly. And I think that's why there was like excess grease when I opened this thing up. But it is neat as to how they were able to engineer a scroll wheel to work with an Apple Watch. Now, the next thing you might think is like, okay, they solved that, but how did they solve the click, like the button? How did they solve, getting into the things that you've selected? Let me tell you, it turns out they didn't. So there's no way to select the things that you've selected using the scroll wheel area. You have to touch and or tap the screen. And the moment I realized this, I was like, this just falls apart for me. Like the moment you're touching the screen, then the whole scroll wheel functionality falls apart, and then this nostalgia element of this thing falls apart, because half of what makes a good scroll wheel is the mechanism of like selecting things. Like this is first generation iPod Nano, super old, but look at this thing, like super precise, right? But if you want to click on something, it's just like, you're in, right? And it's like, it's got this tactile feel to it. Now, on the TinyPod, there is a bit of like tactility as you scroll around because the haptics of the Apple Watch are clicking in, but this is not functional. And I'm like, what is this? And I look on the website and it's not very clear that this is not a button or anything. You have to tap on the screen. And the moment you're doing that, I don't know. It almost feels like a Temu version of what this product could have been if it works the way that we would expect it to. Like if the scroll wheel worked really well, flawlessly, like nicely machined, and everything was tight and effortless and consistent, and also if the button worked, like that would be really neat. But in its current state, it feels like a toy that doesn't work the way that we want it to, if I'm being completely honest. But there is a cheaper version of this that doesn't have the scroll wheel. They have a $30 version that's just like a case for the form factor. And I will say that if you hold this device, it's easier to hold and manipulate it than it would be if you're just using the Apple Watch by itself without any straps. If you're trying to use if this is the TinyPod, this is the tiniest pod, right? There's no, and but this doesn't feel comfortable in your hands if you're using it. So I don't want to knock on the company. I think it's really cool when companies try cool stuff like this. It's interesting. And the idea of it, not gonna lie, it's awesome. It's just that it's not implemented in a way that I think most people will enjoy, especially if you came at this thing, the hope that it would be like this nostalgic experience for the Apple Watch. All right, hope you guys enjoyed this video.